Dead Island 2 has been out for, well, about 2 weeks now, and to be honest, it's been a pretty decent launch. It's not been out of this world, it's not been an outstanding game, but it's certainly not been a bad game. And I do want to make it clear that this video isn't talking about how this is a bad game. I don't think that Dead Island 2 is a bad game at all. I think it is a very, very good game, but we are going to be talking about the negatives of the game within this video, talking about 10 things that Dead Island 2 players hate about, well, yeah, Dead Island 2. And these are things that personally I hate, and also things that I've seen online that other players hate, so a sort of mix between the two of very popular opinions of lots of things that most players seem to hate, and then a few things that I've picked out that I also am really not a fan of within the game. But yeah, just wanted to make it clear that I don't think it's a bad game, since sometimes I do videos like this and everyone thinks that I think it's a bad game, and that's really not the case. I don't think it is at all. But anyways, let's get into 10 things that Dead Island 2 players hate about the game. And to start things off, we're going to talk about the story. So the story is there, but to be honest, it's a really, really unfocused story. It really lacks a proper conclusion and isn't really, it really shouldn't be the main focus of the game. And it isn't, to be honest, the main focus of the game. It's the main idea behind the game in terms of the content that you're playing, but it isn't the main part of the game. It wasn't the main focus when it came to the development of the game. I think the main focus really was with the zombies and the combat, which we'll get into later. But the story really isn't that impressive. It doesn't really add much to the game. There's no real emotional attachment to it at all. It's very, very generic, and it's just sort of there for those that want it. Something to follow by, and, obviously a way to progress through the game, but it's really not significant, and it's not that great. Even with it being the main sense of progression throughout the game, it doesn't really add that big of a sense of progression. Of course, it allows you to get from point A to point B through the missions, but the missions just feel very generic. It just feels like collecting this to open that door, kill those zombies, and get to this location. There's no real proper story. You just don't really get attached to any of the characters that you meet, and you don't really get that attached to your own character either. So the story really isn't anything that impressive, but it is there for those that want something to follow along with whilst they go through the game. It is there in terms of that sort of scenario, but generally speaking, if you're looking for a game with a very good story that will keep you hooked for hours on end, then Dead Island 2 certainly isn't the game for you. But either way, let's move on to the next thing that players hate, and that is the partial open world. Now, Dead Island 2 was never really advertised to be a massive open world game with loads and loads of different areas to explore, a massive map and lots of secrets, and yeah, different secret areas, secret locations that you can find. That was never the idea behind Dead Island 2, but it's still a bit disappointing that the open world really isn't impressive at all. Of course, there are different districts, there's loads of districts that you can go to, but these are very linear. You can't really go exploring certain areas. You sort of have to just follow the mission throughout that area. It's very linear. You just go straight through it. There's not really any different directions you can take. It's not a massive sort of open world area. It's just sort of a track in a way. You're just going through it, and you're going through zombies and stuff like that to complete certain missions, and there's not really that much point in going back to old locations other than to get new loot and kill certain zombies that have respawned. So other than that, there really is, no point to go back to old areas, meaning that it is very, very linear. You're just going straight forward in one straight line. Of course, it looks different in each different districts, and districts are cool, but they're just not that big, and it really hasn't got that sort of open world feel at all. So if you're looking for an open world game, you are not going to get that with Dead Island 2. It's not an open world game, really. It's a partial open world, really, but to be honest, I would say it really is just a linear story game where you are just going through the different areas. Now, with that said, you can fast travel to different areas, but you don't unlock fast travel till fairly later on in the game. So yeah, to be honest, it really isn't that big of an open world game at all, which is a little bit disappointing, but at the same time, it wasn't advertised to be that either. So let's move on to the third thing that players hate, and that is weapon durability. And this was one that I picked out myself, and something I find really, really annoying. Now, when the game was first advertised to have weapon durability, weapon degradation systems, where over time your weapon would break and it would lose durability, I thought that seemed fine, particularly when it was said that you can repair these weapons, which you can do. That is a part of the game, but they just break really, really quickly. You're not even able to get through one mission without really having to switch weapons frequently. They really do break quickly, and it is a bit of an issue for me, particularly early on in the game. You're just switching weapons every 30 seconds since they're just constantly breaking. So I must say, personally for me, I think that having a weapon durability system is a great addition. It adds for a bit of realism. We see it in games like Red Dead Redemption 2, where it works really, really well, but it's just too much within Dead Island 2. It feels like they've pushed it a bit too much. They thought it was a cool idea, and they've just gone way too far with it. It's cool to have, but they just, you know, the weapons break so quickly, which it really isn't that cool. So being able to repair them, of course, is useful, but I do think it's just too much in terms of weapon durability. They just break way too easily. So the next thing is repetitive gameplay. Now, you could argue this with the combat as well, which we'll get onto later, but with this bit, we're going to be focusing on the overall story missions. This ties in with the story that most of the missions feel very, very, very similar and just very repetitive. All the missions just involve finding a key card, whether that's through killing a zombie or finding it in a safe or something like that, then going to a certain area, opening a certain door, meeting a certain character, talking to them for a bit, maybe you find a bit of loot within that area, you go through a building, you kill some zombies, and then you just move on to the next district. It just feels like that throughout the entire game, with a few boss fights and everything in there as well. The overall general gameplay really doesn't feel that impressive. Of course, the combat is really, really nice. The combat is definitely a positive, one of the main focuses of the game. That feels nice, but the overall gameplay does feel repetitive in terms of the missions, and the overall way the missions are designed does feel very samey from mission to mission. It's just, yeah, not much variety there. So the next negative that players hate is that zombies respawn far too quickly. So you could just go forward and then just go back to an area you were at 30 seconds ago, and chances are a load of zombies have already spawned in. Mix that in with your weapons breaking every 30 seconds, then you're going to have a few issues. The zombies just respawn too quickly, and it just feels like there's no sense of achievements and no sense of completion when you kill all the zombies in an area, since, you know, 10 seconds later they've all respawned, which is really, really annoying and can be, you know, a big issue for players. If you're really low on health, all of a sudden you just turn back to where you were to be able to heal yourself, and all the zombies have respawned, which can be really annoying and can be quite frustrating if you just spent all that time killing them just for them to respawn instantly. Of course, having them respawn is going to be nice. That's definitely something that should be part of the game, but it needs to be balanced. You can't have them respawning too quickly, which is the case within Dead Island 2. So the next thing that players hate is with the combat, which is similar to repetitive gameplay, but this is that the combat lacks huge variation. There really isn't much variation in the combat. A lot of it, to be honest, really is just hack and slash. Now, the developers did say there'd be loads of different ways that you could kill certain zombies and lots of different ways you could approach it, but to be honest, you can do it that way if you wanted to, but for most players, it's just going to be going in there with a weapon and killing as many zombies as you can. It feels very repetitive, and since the combat is all of the time, it really does feel repetitive, and it just feels like there could be more variation in terms of the way that you interact with zombies and everything like that. It just doesn't really seem to change that much throughout the entire game, which does bring us straight on to the next thing that players hate, which is there's too much combat. Now, the combat is, of course, the main focus of Dead Island 2, and the combat is great for most of it. It works very well, it feels very clean, there's very clean interactions, and it's definitely the biggest improvement from the original Dead Island game to Dead Island 2, but there's far too much of it. You're just in combat throughout the entire game, and to be honest, that is it. The game is pretty much just the combat. There's not much else to it. The story isn't that great. There isn't much else to do really in the game other than kill zombies. That's the main focus, and it would be nice to have some other things to do, and the main focus not just always be on that combat. So the next thing that would have been a nice addition to the game, which could also reduce the amount of combat, would be some parkour. Now, within games like Dying Light and Dying Light 2, of course, parkour plays a massive part, and generally the Dead Island games and the Dying Light games are compared to quite a lot, right? Because, well, they're both zombie survival games, and a bit of parkour would have been pretty cool within Dead Island 2. Personally, of course, that's not the way that Dead Island has always been, so it's completely understandable it's not part of the game, but I just thought it'd be worth mentioning that parkour would have been nice. It would have been cool to see a bit of parkour, and it would have added some variation to the gameplay. I think that's one of the differences between Dead Island 2 and Dying Light 2. With Dead Island 2, the focus is much more on combat, and I do think the combat is better in Dead Island 2 compared to Dying Light 2, but then Dying Light 2, of course, there's more variation with gameplay. I definitely believe that is the case. When you do have things like parkour playing a massive part in Dying Light 2, that's something I think that could be really cool within Dead Island 2, but unfortunately isn't the case. So let's move on to the final thing that players hate, and that is, well, not really a thing that players hate, but things that players would like, and that is there should be more focus on firearms. That would be really nice. But in Dead Island 2, the main focus is with melee weapons. There are also throwable weapons, but to be honest, they're not used all the time. To be honest, yeah, the main focus really is with melee weapons, and to have more focus on firearms could have been cool, or just to make them more usable. At the moment, they're really not the best way to approach combat. The best way is always with melee weapons, so to make the firearms more powerful and more efficient to use when killing all the zombies, considering that combat is the main part and pretty much the only part of the game, it would have been cool to have a bigger focus on firearms, when unfortunately that isn't the case. So there we go. Those are 10 things that Dead Island 2 players hate about the game. Now, I do want to make clear once again, I don't think it's a bad game. I think it is a pretty good game all around. Definitely has its spot in the market, and in terms of a zombie survival game, you're getting what you pay for here. You're getting a good game with good combat and lots of different zombies to kill, so not much to complain about there. But there we go. That does just about wrap up things here. Now, on screen now, you are seeing a link to a video where I did a complete beginner's guide to Dead Island 2. So if you're interested in watching that, then just hit the link on the screen and go ahead and join me over there.